one just quick point, I think, just regarding Shane, Betsy, and myself. It's interesting because when we got together as a firm, it was special for me being a homegrown Canadian from Toronto, born there. I'm sufficiently Canadian enough because I'm a goalie still. I play hockey, and I think with that though, Shane and Betsy respectively are from Savannah, Georgia, and also from Chicago. So right then and there's an interesting mix, if you will, that we think is a good baseline for the office. But the fact that they actually chose Toronto is interesting for me, even because I think, as we could see here in the slides, we have people like Jane Jacobs, who in fact chose Toronto, spending some good time here, having dealt with Robert Moses, the freeways and so forth. That's kind of an import that we really appreciate. Got to say thank you in a way, because I think our office is a beneficiary of those kinds of ways of thinking about urbanism and architecture, and the real integration of trying to understand the neighborhoods. And we're kind of giving it back with the export of that fellow on the right there for popular consumption. But I think, in terms of actual urban sort of civic mindedness, I think it was interesting for us to kind of play on this a little bit, because we think in North America, cities kind of ignore borders. They are, in a way, sort of a city-states. And I think it's important for us to establish that sensibility to the city we're from. Just quickly, on the surface, quite literally the surface of Toronto, and this is a map of it, there are a series of beautiful disruptions, natural disruptions, these ravines that you see quite markedly in black. And that's the kind of area we operate in. Now, one might think that it's pretty open. We only have one side to the water, to the bottom. It's Lake Ontario. And that might resemble just one limit. Certainly in this town, you got several. But because of that, the actual urban intensification issues, the kind of the gridded streets that were set upon from military outposts over the years through Victorian sort of assembled lots and so forth, we still have these beautiful sort of limitations that are part of the nature that's in front of us. A very important image for us in Toronto is this one. You would see here, looking towards the lake, really, a prominent feature for us. It's the Don Valley ravine system. It kind of is a center of gravity for most of the city, because it actually divides a lot. The image of the foreground is interesting for us because it's a fellow named Roland Harris, who to this day in Toronto, people really revered this fellow for almost a century ago, around World War I, sorry. He had the foresight, the clairvoyance, really, to say, listen, we're gonna build across this huge ravine. We'll tackle that issue because people were just really residing on the other side, and they wanted to build a bridge. And with that, he said, I'm going to actually propose an undercarriage. And they're saying, what are you talking about? And he goes, for the subway, which we didn't have at the time. They thought he was crazy, but sure enough, the guy that actually had the foresight to say, when you plan a city, why don't you start looking at all the systems? Why don't you try to project a little bit? Why don't you try to see what can happen generations beyond? As an office, as individuals in this office, we like that kind of sensibility. It's a little bit of that Gretzky line, where you don't go to where just the puck is, but where the puck will be. And I think that's something that's worth considering maybe as architects. So this kind of index, this graphical index that we see here, kind of reminds us of how fortunate we are in some ways in Toronto. We could see here the obvious voids of the valley that kind of creates these certain areas. But what's interesting, and along the right you'll see a number of projects that we're involved with in the city. Certainly there's others beyond, even beyond the country, that remind us, maybe as a canary in the coal mine, of the kinds of projects that people are still willing to commit to, invest in architecture, even if in increments, even in the aggregate, that they kind of buy into the idea of the city as worth refreshing and recalibrating. And we love the idea that we could take part in that. Part of what we do, though, we think is trying to understand that a lot more. And incidentally, that's our office right there, just to the east side of the valley. And it's a nice touch for the Chicagoan in our office, Betsy, because the building on the right there is the Wrigley building, which we inhabit right now. The guys from Chicago decided to build a beautiful building that we're in right now in Toronto. So if we kind of start to think for ourselves, if there's sort of these kind of two kind of poles of interest that really are kind of in our maybe DNA, or at least in our subconsciousness collectively. One might look at the New City Hall project in Toronto, which, if anything, might have drawn a lot of interest to the city, a city that may not be in the brackets of the Londons, the Parises, the New Yorks, but a city that was willing to commit to an international competition, one that actually resonated certainly beyond, as you could see in these books in Germany and so forth, that let people know of a commitment to architecture as a process, as a civic-minded condition that the city could continue to take part in. You know, that was within the same decade of our Mies van der Rohe project, supported certainly by Phyllis Lambert, who is the now former head of the CCA. And what that means kind of in the generations of architects of Toronto to see, in this case, a slightly more evolved version for sure from the Seagram building as we know. And what that is in terms of our sort of our backdrop, such that you could see a city in relation to the craft and the care and the detail that we see almost daily in Toronto. That's a drawing that we took part in for an upcoming Fiden publication that also just examined the care and craft. And so whether it's a city, the levels of depth of craft, we endeavor to try to take part in that level of investigation, whether by simple, rudimentary even, known ways of fabrication. This is some kind of a candle flute that we're currently under production for. It's tapered, it's got all the old rubbed bronze. It talks to the hope that we see in trying to investigate things that still lets us feel like we can slide the scale. And at the same time, the idea that we feel comfortable with our materials, have a kind of intimacy and a relationship as we explore it in situ, or certainly in the atelier kind of a culture we try to provide for ourselves, such that the blurring of our tools makes us comfortable with just the basic notion that dexterity, you remember that idea, like dexterity, where you actually have that feel of penmanship, whether you're on a tool digitally or it's on paper or with cardstock, those things actually matter to us. And I think in that way, we feel we can inhabit those in-between spaces, those areas where you didn't know you were going to go after those nuances in the iterative process. And that's a part we delight in, because when we try to make and test things, they could be buildings, they could be little studies, even these series of investigations that we've taken upon for things like natural light, for this particular space that we did for an interior design show, Pavilion, or a space that touched on issues which I entitled this thing, Small Fridges Make Good Cities. These are things that actually we see at different scales that might impact the way we want to approach things, and we think that's a good baseline. So right out of the gates, a project that came to us very early on was on the west side of the city, where we had clients that just approached us to see if we could build in the city. And of course, they didn't have a site then, but they said, we think we could get something. They liked the role that we had in understanding the city, and they just had the hunch that we could find something. And in Toronto, it's a good problem. People want to be in the city. They love the idea that we could commit to the streetcar life, the neighborhoods and so forth. So that's the kind of at-issue condition for us, and we really delight in that. You zoom in, and you could see the kinds of block sort of patterns that we have. Main streets really come together nicely with residential streets. And you start to wonder, now where would that be? And you could see here, we took a little bit of a slice here, which is not really much different than the access points to the back laneways. And so this was interesting because it made us want to think, what could we do with these otherwise maybe orphaned spaces that may be forgotten? Do we consider the idea of design where you roll in the idea of maybe prototype or prescription? Then do we consider the idea of how, well, you know, how do we get here? What was that? Parallel to all this, and a lot of our interest in office is deeply invested into the academic sort of balance that we have. I don't think anyone here would think otherwise, that there is that pedagogical academic angle that certainly helps us in practice. This was an excerpt from a study called Sight Unseen, S-I-T-E, Sight Unseen, which ostensibly was looking at laneways, but really the hidden resources in a city that we actually have with us. And this was just a kind of a powers of 10 sort of exploration, just kind of making a point about even in a province, maybe the most dense or populous province in Canada, and then downward right through to the precincts that we're looking at, we could start to say, yeah, you know what, we got the real issue here, why don't we look at it? And kind of in homage to a George Baird document together with Barton Myers, 1978, and interestingly enough, dedicated to Jane Jacobs, we did a study on looking at the different kinds of opportunities that we see, not just in the built form, but the actual lot lines and divisions and so forth. And you started to see really interesting opportunities that are available that you wouldn't otherwise think. We love looking at this sort of slide here because you start to get a deeper, we hope, relationship of understanding that while we think we're maybe trying to make some things just look right, crafted well, there's actually a larger proposition here, one in which we could have the right kind of underpinning of study, and maybe even consider that idea of prototype, one of which was the Bay and Gable, the very far right up top there, that even Stephen Hall in a pamphlet architecture sort of page went as far as to look at the Toronto for its double house. And I think the idea that we could recognize the typological idea, but forward thinking perhaps as a prototype. So we had this site, a very narrow one. People just didn't know what to do with it. It was like the Ugly Duckling site. No one knew how to handle it. It was on the market for a long time. Even had the fire hydrant just to kind of make it even tougher for a lot of people. We put this on, and with this project, it actually only had 11 feet 10 inches clear at its best, actually, and on top of which it actually had no windows on either side, simply because, as we can imagine now, we have the double whammy of people wanting to live in the city, still want to have some basic access to the back, meanwhile having a fire and life safety issue to make sure it's safe for fire spread. No idea of having a window perpendicular facing a neighbor. At the same time, what is the gesture that kind of first comes out? One of the early ones was, clearly, how do you tackle the central part of a home that in a city like ours, we have kind of fundamentally deep lots, about 130 feet in this case. And how do you get there when you have a narrow lot? When you have a wider lot, you could kind of curl it in and so forth. So fundamentally, a kind of an initial hunch that the larger sort of space might offer a way in for light, but maybe a slice back out to even the views out to the trees. The kind of mix of ways we handled it, we get excited by. Digital modeling kind of works at every stage, even at the baseline for conversations with the structural engineer. A lot of lateral strength issues here, which we think, modernist sort of contemporary language really answers that well. It kind of makes you think again when in the early part of the 20th century, the project for the modernist, let's say, syntax might have just been because you just were having not a lot of space, but a lot of interest in living in cities. We felt that for sure. Right down to the crank beams, trying to get travel routes for the right kind of heating and cooling to keep the large window faces open. We like the image on the right. Keeps us honest. It scared the crap out of us when we saw that happen because we weren't sure if everything was going to cave in, but of course we knew it was going to be right because we studied things that way. And we actually have a space up top that we committed to, one that also relied on some sort of smaller maneuvers. While that larger laser-cut steel stair actually gave us the opportunity for lateral resistance, we also wanted to make sure that the natural light, a little bit of light on the inside of the glass, made sure that it wasn't going to be so reflective from the outside. It gave the right balance of light and therefore transparency looking in. Then we call this the kind of the urban detail, really, because the more we studied things and really understood even 1/8-inch laser cut plate steel, when you kind of break form it in different axes, it gives you the resistance that you need so that we could even say that 3/4 of an inch because you need it. And suddenly the idea of the city starts to make more sense. It's actually somehow more viable when you're willing to have a bit of faith in the detail you didn't know you had to do. And we like that. We like that kind of trust in yourself in a future decision. Details could probably handle that. And this was evidence of another way we use that detail to bring in light with our translucent panels coming into the central part of the dining room, which is otherwise going to be landlocked. So we run these kinds of details, whether to transition at the front with gates, with handrails that need to be stiff enough, but smart enough for porosity. And then, of course, into the backyards. It's a sunken backyard, actually, there, just to work with the change in levels that we're really trying to shoot for. If you look on the upper right, of course, of the up there, that is sort of a light scoop that we brought in. We were very greedy for getting natural light in here. It comes from the top of a skylight and then into the room, just to make sure that we could keep that type of lot workable. So we see this, if Galley House was the idea of trying to take orphan space and to try to make it workable, maybe there's a manufactured density that we could look at. On the east side of Toronto, slightly less dense, but still built up sort of fabric, we had ourselves a project where there was an existing home. And if I were to show you where we inserted this thing, and I rotate this in the next slide, you'll see here kind of an existing post-war bungalow, which oddly someone was clairvoyant enough to see that the numbering of these lots were something to the effect of 143, 145, something, and then 149, suggesting that one day someone's going to be smart enough to maybe densify. We chose to do that. Maybe our best move was this basic rectangle where we just severed it in all thoughtfulness, hopefully, to get the right kind of projected project that we still didn't know what it was going to be. But we relied on several details, maybe urban details, that we were hopefully anticipating as something that would come to us. Interestingly enough, on this site, while the other project had issues in narrowness, this one had issues in its depth. Because while we're trying to determine what to do with this tree out here, a lot of the actual neighbors wanted to see if that can actually stay put. We thought, why not? You know, it actually can make a really good space out in the back. And if we just consolidate the 1, 2, 3 of a living, dining, kitchen into maybe one room, in fact, make it feel like one room, even though it might be a kitchen dining, we call it the kitchen studio, and maybe make it a detail that can actually give us an opportunity to run all of our systems behind a flat face, maintaining the very compacted ceiling heights that we needed anyway. That would then give us an opportunity to find detail that actually gave us the urban sort of advantage. And that would be knife edge details in the countertops to save again, right down to the way we actually pull the handles for various pieces. And while doing that, we felt that we can actually get the right kind of project that at a large level has a knife edge detail right back to that central room that we've always, that's kind of the holy grail in many ways in cities like this. Now it's safe for your neighbors, but you could scoop in light towards middle. And I think that's the kind of thing that while we're at it, we just got ourselves a view back to the lake because that tree still needs to be saved. And I think that's where we feel strongly that it's worth trying to get those slices of nature, even the natural light that can come into the city. Just going to invite up Shane Williamson.
So as Don had mentioned, Betsy and I are both imports to Toronto. We certainly consider it to be home now, but it might be appropriate that with Don's positioning of the context of the city, and particularly the constraints that we're faced in an urban context, to perhaps address some of our projects that are outside of the city, certainly avoid certain issues in terms of zoning bylaws, but begin to kind of establish a certain language for the office in terms of architecture's relationship to the landscape, and in many ways have provided us opportunities to transition to larger scale work. And we certainly are an office that has begun by very small means in terms of installations, our fabrication work with furniture, and our residential work, all of which have collectively, I think, have provided a very firm ground and confidence for particularly a clientele to kind of bring us on for more master planning strategies. So I'm going to present a handful of projects very briefly that deal with issues of landscape and scale, leading up to kind of really the primary project, which is a house that we have done that's about 2 hours north of Toronto. And with that house, also use that house as a lens to focus a bit on our own interest in the areas of computation and digital fabrication. So the first project that I'll be showing is actually in Edmonton. It's for Victoria Park. This was a competition which was quite an opportunity for us because in the context of North America, it's very unusual to have open competitions that could potentially lead to public work. It's a very much a constraint that we face in Toronto, and I'm sure it's not dissimilar here. But for the Edmonton Park, for the Victoria Park, the idea was to expand upon the scope of the existing oval, which is used for both leisure and for race training, and to produce a second ice rink that would be bridged by essentially, a landform that would be an extension for the other activities on the site, which both include hiking and cross-country skiing. And so we see the bridge here connecting, and the span between serving as the changing room and the resources for the facility itself. It was a project like this that really fed into an opportunity for a project that we have in the office now that we call Abbey Gardens, which you'll be hearing about a bit later in this lecture. That in this project is a really tight integration with an existing quarry, and there's this notion of this integration of and a transition of purpose for the site from that of a quarry to let's say an agrarian context, and in this case a greenhouse and an educational facility for this more like the kind of the individual supplement and knowledge for the growth of food. And we do have quite a bit of, as perhaps expected, a number of residential projects in the office, and we certainly savor the opportunities for our freestanding projects, not that we don't really appreciate the density of the city that we operate in. But this is in Fox Lake, kind of northeast from Toronto, and the interest in this project is one to kind of look at the notion of a Korean courthouse type courtyard typology. But what's significant, you can see in the section below, in fact, is that there is this kind of eccentric folded roof structure that feeds into the courtyard below, is that there's also a mimetic relationship to the existing terrain itself with this dropping, folded, like origami-like structure. And then northwest of the city, another project in the office that we're quite excited about. It's like looking at a longhouse typology and how a longhouse can be adapted to the eccentricity of a site. And in this case, it's looking at and consistent with the longhouse itself, using what is essentially the kitchen as a primary point of inflection that would adapt to essentially the top of slope for a ridge on the site itself. So we see an initial fold and these other kind of permutations to kind of adapt and reflect the existing topography of the site. All of this playing off the typologies of kind of interesting geometric intersections of this kind of gabled roof throughout the site. And we can see this in the context of a much larger house that exists on this particular site. So these are projects that are kind of in the office now and really are deeply informed by one of our projects, which we've titled The House in Frogs Hollow. Now this house is about 3 hours north of Toronto. It's located in an area of Ontario that's kind of associated with a lot of outdoor activities, cycling and skiing. They're very kind of modest mountains in this area, but it's an active skiing community. And when the client approached us, they have kind of really sincere kind of attachments, their family and the history with this area, and they were quite excited to have purchased this property. One of the things that they weren't so excited about is that we can see it's a very long lot, but adjacent to this lot, kind of in this very rural context, there had been another contemporary building had been built on the highest point of the site. And so they were quite frustrated with the fact that their sight lines from their house would kind of lead to really a fairly kind of unattractive building adjacent to them, immediately to the south. So there was this idea of integrating the project into the landscape, and in doing so, kind of acknowledging what are the primary views, which are prominently northeast in this case, while embedding the project in such a manner that would kind of give it a sense of privacy and would also block sight lines to the adjacent house. And so one of our moves, and this house is about 2,000 square feet, is that So there's kind of very strong kind of tectonic relationship of this concrete wall that certainly plays a primary role in retaining the landscape, but also beginning to set up a condition where the ground floor on the other side has the view out to the landscape, while the second floor has a tie-in. There's a family room here and a green roof to this kind of small hill beyond, which I believe is kind of pretty clearly reflected in this section. And one of our kind of earliest sketches, I kind of endeavored to kind of express kind of very, I think, clean vocabulary and cantilevered form, and the protected nature of this is essentially what would become all of the primary areas for the kitchen and living room and dining room. So it was quite curious is really how close subsequently with construction that this massing became the strong form. And I'd be the first to say that we have a very iterative process, and this is a most deceitful slide that we begin with something, and it just becomes the thing in its own right. But it was curious in this case that the notion of integration in the landscape was a really sincere construct and something that both the client believed in, and we were certainly willing to carry forward. And so the house itself has a very long linear program, which are all, basically embedded into the landscape are kind of service rooms. The family are avid cyclists, and so there's a bit of a space for the maintenance and storage of bikes, and also this is the kind of the feeding point out to the landscape, and kind of a really interesting kind of array of paths that take them both on through their site into the adjacent terrain. But it's this concrete wall which sets up the condition of a very opaque entry, the arrival on this side, which as one turns the corner you kind of open up and you have this kind of really extraordinary view of what is a really kind of a beautiful but a brutal landscape in some ways. So here we see the entryway and this fairly again opaque volume on the top houses just a series of bedrooms and a family room, and the details of which I'll be discussing in just a moment. But it was really the living room, and this it's admittedly a very small space, but it was this view that was afforded to the expanse of the landscape, which was quite significant. And on the second floor, we see there's this elevated volume, which is slightly cantilevered on both sides, which now houses a series of 3 bedrooms and the family room, which is really the threshold and continuity out to the landscape beyond, which we see in this image. And what's really interesting about thinking about the idea of integration, like of architecture in the landscape, is one thinks when making this model, you're certainly confronted with, how do we insert this bar into this milled terrain? And somehow it seems so much easier at that point, when in fact one is confronted with a tremendous amount of disruption before one can convince anyone that there is a moment of integration. And even kind of working, like say, if I were to call this the country, is that the builders are a bit more cavalier. We see things happening like with the kind of excavations without shoring and the like. But then we also find this kind of moment where the project is exposed in a manner, there's a lot of earth that's kind of that'll get moved subsequently, but we begin to see and understand the project in an entirely different way. Now our work continues to kind of operate under quite modest budget. So in a detail like this, we see, for example, a very typical residential formwork, but with a very modest insertion for board form character to kind of carry through, but again only in the areas where we know that that are going to be exposed subsequent to once we kind of get things in place. And there's this idea of this one detail of the board form giving way to the actual siding itself. So there's this, again, it's this transition between the retaining character and the cladding itself. Now, before I speak to some of the details in this project, I'm going to take a bit of a segue, and it's not so much the focus of our talk this evening, but to position our interests in areas of fabrication. We have a tremendous amount of sweat equity in our office in terms of the things that we make. We tend to make a lot of the things ourselves, and particularly this is facilitated through our relationship with the University of Toronto. And over the years, we've done a number of installations and pieces of furniture and objects that have kind of set up a body of work that have positioned us well in terms of thinking about both emerging technologies, both at the fabrication level, but also in terms of wood technologies, which we're currently holders of the Professional Prix de Rome in Canada, in which we're investigating a number of issues outside of Canada relative to really emerging wood technologies. But things begin quite small. So for example, looking at the handles for a desk and the nature of two-sided milling, for example, and really looking and focusing on those points where the hand connects. In this case, one can see just a slight finger pull. Or a prototype in the office right now at a reciprocal wood structure, in this case for table legs, which operates under really quite simple means, but is quite complicated relative to notions of stability, for example. And we also have a tremendous interest in the vestigial artifacts of subtractive processes. This is an interest that certainly was established in times when we were graduate students, that we brought into practice. And so some of these early studies kind of looking at the really supple means of articulation, of looking at laminate stock material that produce, I think, rather expected, like contour-based readings, but then being inspired by the likes of Tapio Verkala and thinking about conflating the notions of orientation, for example, with the laminate structures and stock material, about whether something is vertical or horizontal, is that when it's somewhere in between this lamination, we start to have a tremendous amount of control, not so much on the as much on the overt geometry and form of itself, but the residual pattern of the machining itself. And so we see here, this is a door with peephole, and on the and this is significant. There was a time when we had exhibited this door at the Architecture League prior to their new location. With the door with peephole, there are two sides. The soft side is the one where the peephole is actually proud. It's the interior of the door, where the more defensive gesture on the outside of a door is recessed with this very sharp line. And what was curious about this type of gesture in terms of the thing is that we see the oblique lamination on the side, and this oblique lamination produces a very interesting effect that when we have a flat surface, we have parallel lines. Any sense of curvature begins to kind of hybridize the curvature and mimic it in some ways and carries forward. And so, in fact, this becomes quite a very tedious process in terms of the layup of the stock material and something that is calculated well in advance of its production. And this notion of the artifacts, the vestigial artifacts of machining, there's something, I'm sure there are a lot of people in the room who have either directly been involved with things like milling, or certainly very aware of it. But we also know that there are certain artifacts associated with machining which really aren't built into kind of standard platforms. The idea of these scallop heights, and we see this as kind of an isoparametric lines for the surface itself, is that this is a very expedient way of machining that produces a number of geometric artifacts, some of which are very difficult to calculate outside of things like finite element analysis. But it's these marks that we become quite interested in, and the calibration of these isoparametric lines between these fairly large modules. This was an installation that we had done also for the interior design show in Toronto. And we see these kind of large modules and the relationship between each of the pieces. And this is just a medium density kind of EPS foam. But the marks themselves and their character, where the density, the natural density, the parametric density of the surface itself begins to obliterate kind of the shadow casting character of the surface to kind of render itself in a more kind of like a glossy characteristic. So all of this kind of brings me back to the house in Fox Hollow, where we're trying to find opportunities that both inform the project and potentially intervene in the project. And in this case, there were two aspects for the house, one of which was the siding, and the other was a stair. Both of these provided us opportunities for us to kind of directly fabricate the pieces. And for the siding itself, what was interesting is that this volume that floats above the house is largely opaque. There's essentially one window on each face. And so the idea was that that this volume would become a register for the sun as it kind of moves throughout the day. So this kind of temporal notion of this kind of device that could catch shadows throughout the day. And so we did a number of studies, both at full scale and I believe this was at one third scale, looking at essentially kind of an informed gradient pattern that I believe had 9 different variants that each of which we would be machining ourselves. So there was this kind of intensive study in terms of the speed by which we could produce and get elements on and off the table. That same piece that we saw in that last study model is reflected in this model, and we can see the expansion and contraction of this gradient pattern along this face. And what's most important is that it was the economy of means respective of this fabrication process, where we need as few lines as possible to kind of inform the surface that for each piece that we were looking to produce, but where each one could be on and off the table in I believe about 4 minutes in this case. And so we see on the left-hand side, kind of a fairly oblique view of this pattern, and again on this same face, we see it tightening toward the top, and this kind of giving way to this kind of crenellated edge toward the bottom, and the tighter gesture toward the corner. Now, the second piece in the house that was significant to us was the stair. And in this case, the stair kind of, we consider to be a piece of furniture, particularly respective of the role that it would play in a very tangible sense in terms of the threshold into the house. And it was kind of the distinguishing feature that in some ways is in fact occupying the only, let's say, appreciable section, like the stair itself is the only double height space in this particular orientation. So we see an early study model and the nested ribs that we're going to make this out of. And it's a very curious model because we could be indifferent to the back side condition, because it was really the front side of these ribs which became quite significant. And the stair itself is that this was something that we had that we installed in situ, and it played such a primary role, respective of the hardness of the landscape, and particularly the transition of this cantilevered wall moving into the house. And it plays a prominent role in terms of the kind of distribution of light, and certainly is one of the elements that that catches light in a very significant manner in terms of the threshold. And so, in this case, we see there's a bit of a play in the work that certainly there wasn't the opportunity for this to actually become a solid construction. So it makes a transition from this kind of rib-based structure to a veneer side in this case. And then, there are other aspects in this house as well, where we look to take very kind of modest opportunities, but this is the supply for the HRV within the house, where we, distribute in just in a slightly eccentric pattern, the necessary area for the supply air for the system itself. Now Betsy Williamson will join us.
Hi, good evening. So where Don and Shane nicely showed you the foundation of our practice, primarily the work in the city and the work that we do outside the city where we try to focus on landscape integration, I wanted to show kind of where our practice is moving towards, work that we currently have. About 5 years ago, the Abbey Gardens Community Trust came to us with a really beautiful idea. They wanted to create a hub of environmental initiatives in Haliburton County, which is about 2 hours north of Toronto, not far from some of the other projects that Shane showed just previously. And here they wanted to have a space where the community could demonstrate, come together and see what they could do in response to the the challenges of climate change, carbon reduction, and greening. So it's the Abbey Gardens project that Shane showed the initial slide for. What they did not have was a program or an idea about what they actually wanted. What they did have was a site. This map is in southern Ontario. It shows how many quarry sites for sand and gravel are currently in production. And what we talked about with them was you take the amount of kind of capital that you can get from a stone or sand and gravel quarry, the price per cubic foot. What happens if you introduce food, growing tomatoes, for example, on the same square meter? In 7.5 years, you can make up the same amount of of income that you could from sand and gravel over once the excavation is gone. So this is the site that this community group had in their sites. This is a picture from I think about 2 or 3 years ago, where the quarry was still being used. It was very active, and they started discussions with the quarry owners about remediation. Now, typically, and what the government would appreciate is when a quarrying will start. And just to back up, Haliburton County is primarily a kind of a summer cottaging kind of area north of Toronto. 75% of the inhabitants are seasonal, and only 25% live there year round. The people who were quarrying this site did not do the kind of preliminary work to collect seeds, collect plant material, scrape off all the topsoil, and store it somewhere, which is what the government would hope that one would do on a site like this. But instead just kind of went for it. So the community group identified this as a really great area that they could take on remediation. So what we're left with, this is still when it was an active quarry, and it was just 2013, just this past year, that the quarrying has stopped and the community trust was able to take over the entire site. So now the real work is starting on this project. What they didn't have was the topsoil, the seeds. What they did have was topography. So what we endeavored to do was mark out some dips and swales in the landscape, work with what we had been left with, and create small insertions in a number of different zones that would address potential programmatic requirements or programmatic ideas that the community trust could develop into a larger master plan. Now, it's important to talk about this project in particular because it's significant that in many of our residential projects this happens too. Someone doesn't have a site, they know they need a house. This group had a site, but they didn't really know what they wanted. And so where typically in an ideal world, I guess the client would come to you and say, okay, this is what I want. Let's start schematic design and move through to construction administration, do the whole process. There's a whole first half that we started, in 2009 with this group, talking about what they actually might want, because there was really no definitive. There was no consensus. It's a complicated board, a board that's been changing over the last number of years. And what we talked about as the feature piece was what we refer to as the cradle, setting in a large greenhouse piece with water reclamation that would serve as the main crux of the project, connecting it through a number of LAs, replanting a lot of the forestation that's now gone. We've got this piece down here, which is another large watershed area. And then having a market front here right off the road with some parking and amenity space. And then there's a piece back here that would potentially be used for an arts group. Again, as Shane mentioned, this is the main greenhouse component that we looked at in quite amount of detail with a lot of consultants how to terrace the greenhouse component here. All the water reclamation pieces are buried here, and I'll show a section in a minute. And then it's kind of culminated in what we would call the food spire. And so part of the story that the Community Trust was very interested in was getting people from Toronto to come up, people from the local community to share ideas about food in the community, not just growing, not just about farmers and how to disseminate, their fruits and vegetables in a farmer's market, but to look at if they could bring scholars in, people who could teach courses, to teach cooking classes, and try to look at food from a lot of different angles. So the plan for the cradle piece has a series of terraced greenhouses that are stepping up, and then a landscape berm on the backside with this large the water area here, double height spaces connecting them all through, and this is the main entry that would have been connected to the initial part of the site move. And then in the section, so this is where they didn't have, again, ideas about program. They did have a lot of consultants that we had great relationships with that we were able to cultivate quite interesting sections and ideas about working on this project. So we had worked with a greenhouse consultant and talked about where the meter by meter pallets would sit in section. They could be accessed from both sides. The water would use gravity to drain down. We developed tables both for planting in terms of species, and throughout the year how the pallets would go from the greenhouse to the exhibition fields, kind of on the right-hand side behind it, and move through and cycle through kind of year by year. The farmers were a really huge component of this project. The locals in a place like Haliburton County are really, they don't kind of trust the seasonal people. You could be seasonal for 30 years and you could still be the new guy on the block. So one of the components that we talked about with them was this kind of community center type place where if, say, there was right now in Toronto there's an ash borer beetle, which is a real problem, and so we're cutting down tons and tons of trees. If there was a particular moth or a bug or some kind of mold that they couldn't deal with, we could kind of use Abbey Gardens as a place where you could consolidate the knowledge, bring someone in to help, and it could start to become a hub for the farmers as well. The arts organization, there's an opera company that currently operates out of a church, and similar to the idea of the Glimmerglass Theatre was to build an art space that could have performances and have a very vital kind of cultural component as well. And then, of course, the market front, which is the place where all the fruits and vegetables that are grown there could be sold to locals and people coming in from the community. So a transition now to back to a kind of an urban project that's currently in the office. We're going to look at the Small Fridges Makes Good Cities for one particular reason. The idea of the project is that if you don't have a large refrigerator but a very small under-counter one, you have to go out into the city to buy your food regularly. So the idea that something that we do in the kitchen can make an impact systemically in your neighborhood or street. So here we have Spadina Avenue, the Grange double dwelling, as we like to call in the office, the triple double. And Spadina Avenue is the white line coming down the middle of the screen. And to circle back just briefly to Jane Jacobs, she's the reason why it exists as a vital part of the community, because she stopped the Spadina Expressway from coming through and bursting through Chinatown. So this site is in the Chinatown neighborhood, one of the few places, actually one of the many places in Toronto you can leave your house, walk a block, and go buy all kinds of fresh food every day. It's a corner site. And the clients came to us with a particular spin on the residential program where they were going to combine two households into one for a multi-generational home. There's currently 3 projects in our office right now that are dealing with multi-generational families all living together. One, we developed a suite that was convertible so that when the grandparents want to move in, they can do that with a small conversion. This one here was a corner site where the house was owned for about 30 years by the family. And when the client came to us, the idea was that the parents would sell their house, the clients would sell their condominium, and they would come together. So we started looking at all the zoning regulations that Toronto has and the ability to combine households into one form. So we took what is effectively a legal basement apartment, we added a duplex and a bed sitting room and stacked them all together on a corner site. So the green is a basement apartment, the blue is a front door apartment with street level access, the yellow is a bed sitting room, that would be the grandparent suite, and the red is where Shasana and Ryan and their son are living kind of as the family over the top. Which is nice because it gets the opportunity to use natural ventilation. We can open the doors in the kitchen and air flows right up through the top. So what was important in this project is holding the corner. What you don't see behind on the left and the right, there's corner sites in Toronto, particularly in this area, have a lot of residences that have been converted into commercial buildings. They tend to be much taller and hold the corners. So we wanted to make sure that we built something that could do that. And here's a ground floor plan showing the family on the left and then the apartment on the right, going down to the basement apartment, which is a 2-bedroom with a living room and kitchen, up to the 2nd floor, and the 3rd floor, which is the master suite with ensuite. Now, what's curious about this is if a developer had gotten their hands on this property, there'd probably be 8 townhomes stacked together. So whereas in the Blantyre house that Don presented, we were manufacturing density, in this case, we're actually pulling back a little bit, trying to hold the corner, but make the house look bigger than it actually is. The house is about 3,000 square feet, but we integrated as much outdoor green space onto the lot as we could. That's the corner right there. So, and what's interesting for me in this slide is that we, tried to kind of hide the deck on the right-hand side with this brick form, and made these kind of equitable windows that are all the same dimension in every single bedroom. And just for scale, what you probably didn't realize from the outside is how big and how tall the windows are. So that's Don on the left during construction, and that's the same section there that you see on the right. So he's standing in the master bedroom looking out the large window on the top. And there's under construction, and a little work in the kitchen, and there we are. Back to the CN Tower. Thank you very much.